What if your last private place was no longer private? Not your room, not your phone, not your home, your mind. Welcome to Fractured Realities, where the future rarely arrives with a warning, and sometimes the most dangerous invention is the one that feels inevitable. For most of human history, thoughts were sacred, not because they were pure, not because they were noble, but because they were unreachable. A person could be watched, a person could be followed, a person could be searched, questioned, recorded, exposed. But the mind remained hidden, messy, contradictory, unfinished. It was the only place where a human being could still be more than what they performed. You could smile while resenting someone. You could agree while privately doubting. You could love someone and still imagine leaving. You could picture violence without committing it. You could think the wrong thing and still choose the right action. That distance mattered. It was the space between impulse and identity, between fear and behavior, between what crossed your mind and who you decided to be. And then, little by little, that space disappeared. Not all at once, not with a dramatic announcement. No marching soldiers, no glowing chip forced into the skull. It began the way most dangerous things begin, conveniently. The first systems were marketed as breakthroughs in mental health. Devices that could detect emotional distress before words were spoken. Patterns in brain activity that revealed rising panic, suicidal thinking, violent ideation, cognitive decline. At first, they were optional, life-changing tools for patients, therapists, hospitals. A mother could be alerted when her son entered a dangerous spiral. A doctor could intervene before a breakdown became irreversible. A school could identify a child struggling in silence. And for a while, it looked like mercy. Because some people were saved. Some families were spared. Some lonely, desperate minds were reached in time. The technology worked. That was the problem. Once something works, humanity never leaves it alone. It grows, it spreads, it drifts from healing to optimization. Soon the devices were no longer reading only distress. They could detect focus, honesty, attention, intent. Employers became interested. Schools became interested. Governments became very interested. The language changed. It was no longer about care. It was about safety, accountability, transparency, trust. What if a pilot's dangerous thoughts could be detected before takeoff? What if a surgeon's cognitive instability could be identified before an operation? What if a teacher's resentment, a police officer's aggression, a politician's deception, or a driver's fatigue could be measured in real time? It sounded reasonable. That was how it passed. Not as tyranny, as responsibility. The public resisted at first. People always do. But resistance weakens when fear is involved. One tragedy changed everything. Then another and another. A school attack, a transport disaster. A public figure exposed for secretly planning harm. Each time headlines asked the same question, could this have been prevented? And each time, the answer grew clearer. Yes, if we had access sooner. If we had read the warning signs. If we had listened to the mind before the body acted. That was the turning point. Humanity accepted a new belief. If danger begins in thought, then thought itself must become observable. The first nationwide rollout was framed as protection. A lightweight wearable, a neural band, barely noticeable. Able to interpret cognitive patterns and send alerts when a user's mind crossed into concerning territory. At first, only high-risk professions, then public institutions, then anyone applying for certain jobs. then anyone entering certain spaces, then anyone who wanted insurance discounts, better healthcare, safer travel, educational benefits, or access to enhanced trust environments. And eventually those who refused looked suspicious. Because in a world where everyone claims to value safety, privacy begins to sound selfish. That is how the last free place in the human experience was surrendered. Not through force, through pressure, through incentives, through fear, and through the oldest weakness in society, the desire to appear innocent. At first, people adjusted. They told themselves it only measured risk, only extremes, only harmful intent. But systems do what systems always do. They expand their definition of harm. The line moved quietly. Violent fantasy became a red flag, then prejudice, then obsessive jealousy, then manipulative intent, then sustained dishonesty, then disloyal thinking in high clearance roles, then antisocial cognitive markers, then silent ideological hostility, then dissent patterns. Even unspoken doubt began to matter, if it lasted long enough. Because once a machine is allowed to observe the mind, someone will always ask for more detail, and the machine will always answer. Soon, thought profiles existed for everyone. Not transcripts, not exact sentences, something worse. Interpretations, probabilities, summaries of your hidden self. A person could now be described not only by what they did, but by what they repeatedly thought. Risk score, aggression score, truth deviation index, empathy stability, destructive ideation frequency, social trust rating. A new identity formed beneath the official one. Not your legal name, not your public reputation, your internal reputation. The version of you built from everything you never meant anyone else to know. And people discovered something horrifying. No one was consistently good on the inside. Not completely, not always. The mind is not clean. It is not linear. It produces cruelty, shame, lust, fear, pettiness, revenge, ego, curiosity, absurdity, and contradiction at speeds too fast for morality to keep up with. That had always been true. But before, humanity understood something quietly wise. A dark thought is not the same as a dark person. That wisdom did not survive the system. The system could not tolerate ambiguity. It could only categorize. And so the world changed. Couples began checking each other's trust summaries, not because they wanted to, because they could. Parents began reviewing the cognitive risk trends of their children, not because they enjoyed it, because every warning came wrapped in the possibility of prevention. Schools used thought analytics to group students more efficiently. Employers used them to predict loyalty. Courts used them during sentencing. Dating apps used them for compatibility. Governments used them for social stability. Religious leaders used them to measure purity. Influencers used them performatively, broadcasting their thought reports to prove authenticity. People stopped asking, "What did you do?" They started asking, "What were you thinking?" And eventually, "What have you been thinking lately?" That question became more dangerous than any accusation. Because a person can defend an action, how do you defend a passing thought? How do you explain an intrusive image, a moment of doubt, a split-second flash of anger? A fantasy you never chose to entertain, but which arrived anyway. The system did not care. It measured patterns. And humanity, terrified of one another's interiors, began to demand impossible purity. Public life became theater. Not because people were more honest, because they were more afraid. Language changed. People grew slower around each other, careful, curated. They did not just monitor their speech. They learned to monitor their minds in real time. Meditation surged. Cognitive discipline became a status symbol. Mental self-management industries exploded. People paid fortunes for courses designed to reduce negative inner content, because a clean internal record meant opportunities, status, access, safety. The wealthy found ways to game the system first. Of course they did. Luxury cognitive dampeners reduced the visibility of undesirable thought patterns. Elite neurostylists helped train the mind around flagged topics. There were private retreats where the rich learned how to think beautifully under surveillance. The poor, meanwhile, were punished for being human in public. The system learned that poverty produced stress. Stress produced dark thinking. Dark thinking lowered trust scores. Low trust scores reduced access to jobs, housing, and mobility. And so the people most in need of grace received the least of it. The machine had promised fairness. It delivered a cleaner form of cruelty. And still, society defended it, because some harms did go down. Certain crimes dropped. Some violence was interrupted early. Fraud became harder. Predators were detected sooner. That was what made the system so difficult to reject. It was not fully evil. It was useful. Useful systems survive longer than monstrous ones. People can resist monsters. They struggle to resist convenience. But the deepest damage was not political. It was personal. Friendship changed first. Then love. You could no longer sit quietly with someone and wonder what they were feeling. The mystery was gone. Or worse, replaced by a summary. People stopped discovering each other slowly. They audited each other. First dates became data exchanges. Marriages collapsed under internal transparency. Not because people were cheating more, because their hidden resentments now had numerical weight. Someone could forgive a mistake. It is much harder to forgive a pattern. Imagine being told that the person you love had recurring cognitive markers of withdrawal, or comparison, or attraction elsewhere, even if they never acted on it, even if they chose you every day. The mind was no longer allowed to wander without consequence. And that meant love was no longer allowed to be fully human, because real love has always survived on mercy, on the decision to remain with someone despite what passes through them in their worst, weakest, loneliest moments. When thought became evidence, mercy became irrational. Children grew up differently too. A whole generation was raised knowing their internal life could be interpreted before they themselves even understood it. They learned not to trust their own minds. A frightening thought was no longer something to question. It was something to fear being seen having. A cruel fantasy was no longer a passing storm. It was an early sign, a marker, a profile update, an archived possibility. And slowly, a strange new illness spread through society. Not paranoia, not exactly, something quieter. People became frightened of themselves, not their actions, their potential. They stopped seeing the mind as a place to explore. They saw it as a crime scene waiting to happen. And when humans lose the ability to privately wrestle with darkness, they do not become better. They become brittle. Because goodness is not the absence of bad thoughts. Goodness is what happens when a person confronts them and still chooses well, without witnesses, without points, without fear. That was what disappeared. The invisible moral life, the private battlefield where character is actually formed. In the old world, a person could think something ugly and then reject it. They could imagine cruelty and decide against it. They could envy, rage, desire, resent, or doubt, and still quietly become decent through restraint. In the new world, restraint no longer mattered as much. Exposure came first. Judgment came first. Context came second, if at all. And so the world grew outwardly safer, while inwardly less free. Then one day, something happened that no one expected. The system made a mistake. Not a technical mistake, a human one. A beloved schoolteacher was flagged as a severe future risk after weeks of escalating intrusive violent imagery. The alert spread through the network. Employment terminated, neighbors warned, access restricted. News outlets got the story before she did. People were horrified. Because everyone knew her, she was gentle, patient, soft-spoken, the kind of person who stayed late to help the children others forgot. And yet the system insisted. Her mind showed danger, sustained, graphic, violent ideation. The story dominated the country, and then the truth emerged. She had been writing a novel, a crime novel. The system had not failed to read her mind. It had failed to understand imagination. That changed everything. Because once people understood the scale of that error, they began to see the larger one. The system did not merely monitor thought, it flattened it. It treated imagination like intent, fear like desire, intrusion like identity, creative darkness like secret violence, private contradiction like hidden guilt. For the first time, people asked the question too late. What exactly have we handed over? Because the human mind was never designed to be clean enough for surveillance. It is too symbolic, too chaotic, too emotional, too unfinished. It jumps, it wanders, it rehearses disaster, it invents scenes, it revisits pain. It plays with possibilities. It tests forbidden ideas in secret so that the self can understand what it truly believes. The mind is not a confession. It is a wilderness. And wilderness does not survive being turned into a spreadsheet. A movement began after that. Small at first, then growing, people removed their devices, broke contracts, refused scans, refused internal reporting. Not because they had something to hide, because they had something to protect. The final human freedom, the right to think badly and still choose well. The right to wrestle privately with fear, doubt, anger, temptation, grief, and contradiction without being turned into data. The right to remain more complex than a system can score. Some called them dangerous, others called them rebels. But a quieter name spread through the movement. They were called the unrecorded. People who believed that if humanity was to remain human at all, there had to be one room no machine could enter. One place where a soul could tremble, break, argue, wander, pray, imagine, regret, fantasize, and recover, without an audience. Maybe that is where the real story begins. Not with the invention, not with the system, but with the question left behind after the collapse of privacy. If every thought you had was recorded, who would survive being fully known? And maybe the answer is simple: no one. Not because humanity is evil, because humanity is unfinished. And perhaps that has always been the point. We are not meant to be judged by every thought that passes through us. We are meant to be judged by what we do with them. The choice, the restraint, the return, the quiet decision to become more than the worst thing your mind briefly suggested. Take that away, and you do not create a more moral society. You create a more frightened one. A society less interested in goodness than in appearing harmless. And there is a difference, a terrifying difference. So if a future ever comes where your thoughts are no longer private, do not ask first whether the system is accurate. Ask whether humanity can survive without mystery. Ask whether mercy can survive without distance. Ask whether love can survive complete internal exposure. Ask whether freedom means anything. If the last space where you can still be raw, uncertain, contradictory, and unfinished belongs to someone else. Because maybe privacy was never about secrecy. Maybe it was about dignity. The dignity of becoming. The dignity of struggling in silence. The dignity of being more than a machine's interpretation of your darkest moment. And maybe the mind was never supposed to be perfectly clean. Maybe it was only supposed to be yours. In this reality and the next, never stop chasing the fractures.